impressed me and what, I don't do a lot of public speaking, maybe 5 times a year, something like that now, because I mostly do farming. And for instance, until 1 o'clock today, I was digging out docks and nettles, and that's why my fingernails are painted, because I couldn't get them clean. So, but I liked Trevor, and the fact that he was 8 months ahead, that was like really on the ball. And I liked the name of the conference, Open Minds. Why do we have an open mind? We have an open mind for one reason and one reason only, and that's to find out the truth, right? And it's not my truth or your truth or what. It's the truth. The truth is the truth. You can't get around it. You know, it's like a wall. Knock up against it. You know, it's there. And it's our job to keep our minds open so that we don't get stuck in ruts that are comfortable or convenient or are just part of our team, like we root for this team, so that can't be true. We keep our minds open because our lifetime job is to learn the truth, to know the truth, and to love the truth. So that's why I'm here. And I had an idea, oh yeah, and I should also say, I asked Trevor what I should talk about, and he said, talk from your own experience. And that's great, because I'm one of these people that as close as I keep coming to the truth, it's only the hard way. It's only from getting it wrong. I'm not one of these people that can think it out and, you know, just spot the right thing. I have to get it wrong, and that's how I find out the right thing. So I have a lot of those kind of experiences. Now, I was thinking, what would I talk about? And had kind of confined it to, I was going to give a little bit of time to 4 areas: disability, politics and media. That's a really interesting story, considering Brian's talk. Health, farming, and faith, right? 5. But you know what? I came today, and in honor of the closed mind protest outside, I'm going to do something very naughty. And I'm going to leave disability for another day, though it'll come into it. I'm going to leave politics and media, which is a really juicy subject, for another day. And I'm going to dig straight into health and farming. And maybe I'll get a minute for faith later, okay? Now, it's kind of an interesting irony that I wound up where I am today with the ideas I have, and I'm going to share the stories with you, especially around the issue of vaccination. And the reason this is very vital is that we all have the specter of mandatory vaccination coming very close, looming. Now, when I was born, 6 weeks before I was born, my dad was drafted into the army. He had only been in the army for a few months during World War II because he was a medical student, and they had left them to the very end of the war. And when they let them back out, they said, but we can grab you anytime because we left you off the draft. So when Korea came, he was drafted. Now, at that stage, he had 5 kids. Well, number 5, me, on the way. Baby boom days. So about 2 weeks after I was born, we headed out to California to Camp Cook, and we lived in the Army hospital. We had my mother says it was the best house she ever had. She had 8 high-powered faucets. She had 8 bathrooms, stalls. She had hallways kids could drive trikes in, etc. But my job, it's very funny, from the very beginning, was at night when she was putting the other 4 to bed, my father would scoop me up and take me to do the evening rounds of the patients, the soldiers. And things like painkillers and things, they weren't in very good supply, and people were coming back from Korea with serious injuries. So my job was to be handed to the soldier. So they had to stay still while my dad changed a dressing or checked something. But my job was to help them with the worst problem of all, which was homesickness. So from the very beginning, I kind of got put into the health setting. And on Halloween, just after my birthday, I was dressed up as Raggedy Ann. So from then on, all the soldiers called me Raggedy Ann, which is quite interesting because Raggedy Ann, the author of Raggedy Ann's daughter, was a vaccine victim. And there's a big debate on whether or not he wrote Raggedy Ann about his daughter or if it happened after. It's a very interesting debate because, of course, she became very, very floppy. She lost all of her skills. She lost her ability. Sounds a bit like a HPV victim, doesn't it? It lost her ability to dress herself and do everything, and eventually languished and died. So anyway, there was a little premonition there. Now, many years later, my sister Megan was born, and Megan had Down syndrome. Now, back in those days, you didn't know until the baby arrived, and Megan was the heart and soul of my family, but when she was in hospital and when her condition was discovered, the hospital did what hospitals did back in the early 60s, is said, well, why don't you leave her here and go home to your other children? Of course, that wasn't what happened. She was brought home, and she was the glue for my family. But she also had another effect, because my mother's two sisters arrived up when Megan was about 2 months old. And you know the brown paper American shopping bags, you know the grocery bags, you see them on the American sitcoms. They each had one of these big bags in their arms, and they marched in upstairs to where my mother was very patiently breastfeeding Megan because she was a very slow eater. And they spent the morning there. It was the first time they had ever come to my house like that. They had always brought their kids. We had always had a great time. But this time it was up the stairs with my mother. When she came down, our life was changed because they had given her a lecture about health foods. Her health was very poor before Megan. She had 4 Adele Davis books. Does anybody know who Adele Davis was? Yeah. She's the grandmother of the health movement. 4 Adele Davis movement. Eat well to keep fit, how to, whatever, anyways. And the bags had been full of brewer's yeast. Now, this is real brewer's yeast, not the wimpy stuff they have today. Wheat germ, et cetera, cod liver oil, which you in Ireland were taking for years, but in America we'd never seen it before, et cetera. And our life was changed. We were tormented. I still, to this day, have never been able to drink beer or Guinness because of the taste of brewer's yeast. And you couldn't get on the school bus until you had glugged down tomato juice. I also can't eat tomato juice. Tomato juice and brewer's yeast and all of this. And we all got kind of healthier and healthier. And my mother then had number 13, who was 1 ounce under 13 pounds and is a genius. He's now a priest, a PhD in Thomas Aquinas. He speaks medieval German, Latin, French, etc., and has been invited into Menses, which he wouldn't be bothered with. And the second one, number 14, the finale, was also huge and healthy and also a genius, as now is academic dean in a college. So we kind of saw, and we saw my mother, who now, whatever age she was when Megan was born, was now about 15 years younger, buzzing around the place, et cetera, et cetera. So I mention this because this was my background in terms of I understood the connection between health and food and things like that. But the one piece that was missing, inexcusably, was my trust of the medical system. And I had no excuse for that, because when I was about 4 or 5 years old and the polio epidemic was raging, you can all figure out my age now, and the polio epidemic was raging in America, we were not allowed to get the Salk vaccine because we had a public health officer in a place called Oak Park, Illinois, where Hemingway came from and Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect, came from. And he said, this has not been tested. I do not trust this vaccine, and I will not allow it into Oak Park until we have public meetings where we find out the situation so people can make an informed choice to have this. Now, this was a very brave thing at the height of the polio hysteria, right? And the morning that he was going before a panel to have his job taken away and possibly his medical license taken away, providentially, the headline on the front of the Chicago Tribune is that the government had withdrawn the Salk vaccine because of many of the same problems he had said. And that's all that kept him as public health officer. Now this man, ironically, rather than make me suspicious of vaccines, this made me trust them. Why? Because surely if it were bad, there would be a Dr. Ratner to tell us, right? I only realized later that there was only one Dr. Ratner. And I'll just tell you one little story about him, because I'm not doing the other topics, I can divert a little bit. When he was in his 90s, he went to a medical conference, and at the lunchtime, he went up to a Dr. Carboni of Loyola Hospital, and he said, I have something I think you want to see. That's all. He gave him his address, which was not far from Loyola, and said, I have something you want. Dr. Carboni, who was a bone specialist studying these rare bone cancers, which were becoming very, very much more common, kept thinking, oh, every lunchtime he'd think, I should stop in on that old guy, but I'm so busy. And finally, his conscience, because he had promised to do it, after about 6 weeks, his conscience finally bothered him. And he did pop into Dr. Ratner's house. Now, Dr. Ratner is about 92 years old. And he welcomed him in, sat him down, and he went down to his basement to an old freezer that had been sitting there since the 1950s and brought up an original package of polio vaccine. Now, Dr. Carboni had searched every company, every health authority to get original polio vaccine because he suspected that the simian virus that was teaming up and that he was finding in every bone cancer had come from the polio vaccine, but he couldn't prove it. And 5 of the vials were still intact, and every single one of these vials had SV40. Now, it's Dr. Ratner, one of the heroes of our day. However, my assumption that there were lots of Dr. Ratners and good doctors like my father made me think vaccines must be fine, because otherwise somebody would complain. So anyway, move on, and I would have had very few vaccines. Did you ever hear the saying that the plumber's kitchen is the one with the leaky sink? Yeah, well, my dad was a doctor, so we were the ones that hardly got any vaccines, not because he was against them, but because he'd always, forgot to bring it home. Da, 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 da. So I had a diphtheria, I had the polio on a sugar cube when the Sabin vaccine came out, not injected. I don't know if I had anything else. Thanks be to God. But I didn't realize for my children. And my 3rd child, Jamie, who's now just turned 42, got his first vaccine at 4 months. That would have been the diphtheria, the tetanus, pertussis, with a drop of polio. And all I remember about that weekend is, I mean, he was a fussy, colicky baby. Anyways, but the crying had changed. It wasn't colic crying. It was something excruciating. His back was arched, and with his little hands, he was pushing at his head. Basically he cried for the next 3 months, but that weekend was so intense. Now, my father was away, and when he came back, because he had seen Jamie as a small baby, he told me there's something wrong with Jamie. Now, what had happened after that is that he lost all of his abilities. Like, he had his head up. He couldn't hold it up anymore. And of course, everything that happened to him, I made an excuse. I knew he'd just been vaccinated, but I thought, he's got such a big Kelly head. You know, he can't hold it up. And he had a cousin 4 days older, who's one of these friars of the renewal working with heroin addicts in New York now, big, strong farm guy. And Jamie was 4 days younger, but always ahead of him. He had his head up first, he had, and at 2 or 3 or 4 months, that's, significant, a few days earlier. But he lost everything. He had been doing that thing that babies do on the floor where they push themselves with the foot like the hand of a clock. The next thing they do is flip over. And that's the point at which he stopped and could do nothing but scream. Now, I did think about the vaccine, but of course, vaccines are safe, right? I mean, you wouldn't be getting them if they weren't good. Good doctors wouldn't do that. But when we discovered he had autism, and because he went at 4 to 5 months, he also had mild cerebral palsy, which he hadn't had before, and, a lot of motor planning problems, because that was the top card on his developmental deck. It's when you get caught, they will characterize the problems you will have. Bettelheim was all the rage at the time, so I'd never heard the word autism before. In fact, I thought they were saying he's artistic. But when I started to look it up, and remember, we had no Google. So when I tried to find out about it, everything led to Bettelheim, the only one talking about it. Bruno Bettelheim was a doctor in Chicago who had come up with a theory, which is still prevalent in France today, that it was the refrigerator mom makes their children autistic. Cold refrigerator moms. Now, here I am, co-sleeping with Jamie, breastfeeding him, he's in my arms all the time, your typical refrigerator mom. But moms are really easy to guilt trip, right? You tell a mom it's her fault and she says, "Oh, how did I do that?" Not, "You must be joking," No, moms are great. You tell them they're wrong and they believe it. So we went on this thing of, I must have done this to him. And even that was hard to sustain, because how would my fumbling the emotional football have caused the kind of bowel problems, the stomach problems, these incredible physical problems he was having? But I was willing to take that, right? But then other things started to happen. One of my kids, because we were taking Jamie to Chicago to get some help for him, because there was nothing here. Nothing here. Most doctors had never heard the word autism at that stage. Now it's it's like, I won't say every other kid. By 2030, it'll be every other kid. Right now, it's 1 in 25, whatever. It's getting there. When Jamie was first diagnosed, it was 1 in 10,000. Right? By the time he was 5 years old, they were talking about 1 in 2,500. Okay, but then we were going to Chicago, so I hadn't put one of my kids in school. I hadn't put my kids in school because we were going to be leaving and we kept getting delayed. So I was teaching myself, and I still have copybooks where one of my guys was not just reading, not just writing, but he was writing in script, right? 7 years old, he's writing in script. we went to America, and in order to go to school there, while I'd be doing sessions, you know, taking Jamie in and out of Chicago to do sessions, we put him in school, he had to have the measles shot. But he'd already had measles, but he had no proof of it. So he had the measles shot the night before he went to school, and within 3 weeks, the school was contacting me to say, this kid is off the wall. Now, he was a really gentle kid, really nice kid, never any problems. And now he's off the wall, nobody can be in the same room with him, blah, blah, blah. And they gave me a tutor at home. This was America, not like Ireland, you just scrap heap. So he had a tutor at home, and I'd be coming home from the hospital, from the Dysfunctioning Child Center in Chicago, and the tutor was saying to me, well, we're trying to help him with his letters. We're trying to help him. And I'm thinking, he can read whole books. What do you mean you're trying to teach him his alphabet? But I just kind of thought, I'll think about it later, because we were just so... And it turned out, by the time I got back to Ireland, I realized he could no longer read, he could no longer write. He still can't write script. And he's very bright. But he had lost all of that. When he was 16, we finally went to a developmental optometrist who identified that, you know, the measles works on this, on the connection between the brain and the eye. That's why when we had measles when we were young, we were always kept in dark rooms. You were always kept in a dim room when you had measles, because it dealt with this visual perception. So this was the exact same place that had been skewed. So the reason he could no longer read is he could no longer focus on the words. It wasn't an intellectual problem. He could no longer focus on the page. The page would move. The letters would kind of slide off the page and all of this. So, and it was funny, he went to remedial school, and they had to make an exception to accept him in remedial school because his IQ was so high. But he couldn't read. So for 2 years he went to remedial school in Cork, and it wasn't really helping. But he could not read. Do you remember the books, Sean and Maura? Don't be telling people you know that. Yeah, and Rusty the dog. He could not read any of that. And yet he could stare at Lord of the Rings and know exactly what it was saying. He couldn't read me a line of it, but he knew the story inside and out and read those, just gobbled those books. You know, he's 8, 9 years old, gobbled the whole trilogy, The Hobbit, but he couldn't tell me how he could read it. And the developmental optometrist explained that it was so skewed that it was such an effort to focus that if he wasn't interested, he couldn't focus. But if he was interested, he basically could nearly read the whole page in one look. But he had to really focus because he had to be interested. So then the other one, who to go to school in the US got the single measles, which is what was offered then, hadn't had measles. And that was fine, nothing seemed to happen, went to school, happy as can be, until we got back to Ireland, and 2 years after we got back to Ireland, contracted measles. And what happened is 3 of them got measles, 2 of them very normal cases, 2 that hadn't been vaccinated, but the one that had been vaccinated had what's called an atypical case. First sick, last well, 2 or 3 spots. In other words, the virus couldn't leave. And the health of that particular child changed completely. Like we were basically never sick. But every month nearly, she had something from that point. So was it an effect? Was it not? I can't be sure. But then they introduced the 3-in-1 in Ireland. And they had a catch-up. They called them the catch-up kids. So they offered this to every child between 18 months and 5 years old. Does anybody remember that? Was anybody a catch-up kid? This would have been 1990 maybe? maybe about 1990. And 3 of my kids were catch-up kids. Again, you say to yourself, I say to myself, how did you not know, even at this stage, how did you not know? Trust. Trust and brainwashing is a very powerful thing. So these 3, 2 of them were in Montessori, and 1 was at home, toddling around. And they had started Montessori in September, 1 the year before that. So 1 was there for a year and a half, and 1 was there for half a year. And when we met with the teacher, they got this in January, when we met with the teacher in the spring, she said, you know, I don't know how I didn't realize this about the older one, the one she'd had for a year and a half. But he seemed to learn very well in the past, but now he's so bright, he learns everything. And the next day he comes in, that's the Angela's. Will you put that off? It's in my bag, just. Yeah, just. So anyway. Especially this one, because there's so much stuff in there. Okay. Okay. So the oldest one, the teacher suddenly realizes he comes in every day. He just works and focuses and learns so much. And the next day he comes in as if he never saw it before. And we do all the same work. It was Groundhog Day every day. And she said she had never seen anything like it, nor did she remember him being like that for a year and a half. Weird. Again, brainwash, hard to. The second one, the other one in Montessori, she had had since September, but after January, when we met her in March, she said, you know, I never noticed it in the autumn, but it's like he's deaf. She said, I'm actually doing techniques for the deaf, like holding his arm and speaking so that her breath, he can feel it on his arm, because he doesn't seem to be able to take in anything through his ears. And I was like, oh, strange. It was a very strange teacher meeting. And then the little one at home, who had gotten it at the right age, is twitching all the time. And doing all these little twitchy things. Huh. So finally, a few years later, oh yeah, and the one that couldn't hear started to have all the glue ears and all the ear problems that kids get in their first year, you know, in their between their first and second birthday. You know, all these kids, they get all this, and people actually think it's normal that your child has earaches all the time and is taking antibiotics all the time. But what was odd about him is that didn't start happening till he was 3. And the doctors would even say, it's like he should have had this a year and a half ago. So he goes through this whole thing. But he hadn't had something to kick it off. So finally, you're probably asking yourself, when is she going to cop on? I got the one and only flu vaccine that any of my family ever had. That the advertising, and we didn't even have television, but it even reached me. And every time I would go for the 1 or 2 hours that he had a week of daycare, I would be bombarded about the flu vaccine. So finally I thought, well, Jamie's in pretty good shape, so let's keep him that way. And it was October. And so I took him one evening to the doctor's evening hours, got the flu vaccine, put him to bed, and the next day he was so sick he couldn't even get his head off the pillow. He had a flu that lasted for weeks and weeks, and whenever he would kind of get a little better, his better was his former sick. He would just then sink into another flu, and this kept going for a year and a half till he wound up in a wheelchair. No longer able to walk. He couldn't walk very well anyways, but he no longer could walk. He couldn't even do the bits that he had learned to do. And he was in hospital with pneumonia. He kept getting pneumonia. And at that stage, my dad gave me a copy of the Physician's Desk Reference. Have you ever seen the American Physician's Desk Reference? It's like the old Bibles, huge. And I looked up the flu vaccine, and was I surprised? Adverse effects. First one, death. Yeah. And then past the death one, which we were on our way to, was everything Jamie was suffering. The loss of, motor, even the bit, he already was very compromised in motor, etc. He was having very severe seizures, etc., and just constant flu. And I should just say, there was one more. My daughter had been born in October. My number 9, my baby. And it was a home delivery, everything great, she was healthy. And 4 times, 4 evenings, she wasn't breathing. Now, it wasn't one of these dramatic things, it was just, I don't know if any of you have breastfed, you know your child. And she was forgetting to breathe. And I would ring the midwife, and I would say, she's forgetting to breathe, there's something wrong. Should I bring her to the hospital? And she said, well, by the time you get there, she'll probably be breathing again. So she had these really serious breathing times. Now, fortunately, she was in bed with me. She said, put her on your chest, sit up and do not go to sleep. Get her to breathe with you. And that's what I did, and at about 2 or 3 in the morning, same thing each time. She then was normal again. She was breathing again. I can't explain it, but if you've breastfed, you know what I'm talking about. You know. So, but what was interesting when I rang the midwife, the 3 times I rang her, by the 4th time I was an expert, right? The 3 times I rang her, I said, but she was fine, I just had her to the doctor. And the only reason I went to the GP in her whole childhood was to get the 3 doses of diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. In fact, she didn't get the pertussis because of Jamie. She got the 2-in-1 and polio. And then a few months later, when I'm sitting by Jamie's hospital bed, pulled out the Physician's Desk Reference, I don't know what the doctors felt about that, and read that, I thought, that's it. Cop yourself on. You have known this all these years. You have made excuses, right? So that was the last. I won't say it was the last vaccine because I refused vaccine at his service in 2000. And with 5 phone calls later, I'd been called a bad mother. I'd been called someone that was risking his life because I wouldn't let him have this, etc. Continually refused, but on the day it was given, I get a phone call that he's in the emergency room having uncontrolled seizures. Seizures he had never had before, that type of seizure. And when I got discovery, that day, everything's blacked out. They vaccinated him. None of the 6 people in the class could speak. So no one was ever going to know. But then Jamie almost died. And I had his seizures down to 1 in a month with diet and things like that. And it's never been that well controlled since. Many injuries later from drop seizures and things later. But, okay, so I'm just going to say a little bit more. Back in those days, you had to buy books, which meant you had to find books, you had to order books, libraries didn't carry things like that. There's no excuse now. I really think had I had Google back then, we would have saved a lot of my children, a lot of heartache. But a couple of things. I had a thing called the Hope Project Helpline. For 10 years, I manned a helpline. Mainly to get services for people, physiotherapy, get children with disabilities into classes, whatever. We would try to figure it out. And I talked to many, many people, and I can tell you, an incredible percent of the people who are disabled in this country now, I would highly suspect vaccination. Highly suspect. And it wasn't just me. In many cases, the parents knew it. Because it's interesting. At one point, I wrote down all of these adverse effects that had happened. And I wrote down Jamie's story, and I rang up the Irish Medicines Board. And I said, I want to send you a report of an adverse vaccine reaction. And they said, oh, yes, okay, send it to this address. And they said, but you're a medical professional? I said, no. And they said, oh, I'm sorry, you can't make a report then. You must be a nurse, a midwife, or a doctor, or a pharmacist, or you can't. So I said to them, but I'm going to send you this report, and then you're going to have it. And they said, no, you can't. And I said, okay, if I physically post this to you, what will you do? Will you throw it in a bin? And they said, no, we won't put it in a bin. And I said, well, what are you going to do with it? And she said, well, we'll put it on our invalid file. So I wrote a letter to the Irish Medical Times about the, juxtaposing the invalid file with the invalid file. That this is, but we could not. So unless you're a member of the cartel, who can be trusted not to make a report of an adverse reaction, you can't report. And yet it's very interesting. If there's a car accident, what do they look for? Eyewitnesses. I was the eyewitness over and over and over again. And these parents that would ring me on the Hope Project helpline were the eyewitnesses. But we were the ones who could not let them know what had happened, right? Now I'm going to tell you a little, well, before I do that. So an interesting thing, and it kind of is an indication of the protection around this. So I started to learn, once I got rid of Bettelheim out of my head and got rid of the brainwashing, I really started to get very serious about diet and things, because it seemed to be the only thing that was helping. Gluten-free, dairy-free, blah, blah, blah. So I organized a conference in UCD. It was the first medical-based conference on autism. In fact, autistic spectrum disorder, only that hadn't been invented yet. That title hadn't been invented. So we put it on in 2004 in the spring. And I had Jeff Bradstreet. Anyone know the name Dr. Jeff Bradstreet? Lovely man. And loads of other people, including Wakefield, all at UCD, right? And it was a magnificent conference. We got so much out of that. And there are parents today who just changed the tact, started to do diet, etc., from that day. But what was interesting is the day after the conference, Dr. Jeff Bradstreet asked me, would I drive him to this research center? It was a government-paid research center. It was just a small building on the grounds of a hospital in Dublin. Would I take him there because his autistic son's biopsy from the terminal ileum, which is right below the stomach, the very top of the GI tract, that biopsy was being sequenced in this clinic. There was an Irish doctor, a guy from Cork, lovely, lovely guy, who was doing the PCP or whatever, anyway, where they sequence the viruses. They first look to see what's in the nodules on the colon, which was what Wakefield had described, that they were taking biopsies of those. They were sending them to Japan or Dublin, and they were sequencing the genetics. And his sons were waiting to be done. And it's quite interesting because, among other things, and I know a woman whose son was done, his were sequenced, and it was the patented Merck measles virus that was in creating the nodules in her son's, it's a cork mother, and her son's intestines, and the terminal ileum. So they had a wonderful doctor-to-doctor chat there, and I was kind of just trying to understand a little bit of it, and he hadn't gotten to his son's things yet, but he was telling me a bit about what he was finding in these samples. So about a month or so later, I'm lobbying Micheál Martin, Minister for Health at the time, or maybe it was a few months later, and I'm at his clinic in Carrigaline, and I'm saying to him, look, they're actually finding the vaccine virus in these nodules, in these tumors, these sores in their gut. And it's being done right here in Ireland. So he's like, oh, wow, this is so wonderful. Who's doing it? Like a total idiot. I told him the name of the doctor. He said, oh, and I said, and he's from Cork. He's a graduate of UCC. Oh, wow, better and better. Boy, we can be proud of him. Within 1 month, that doctor was told he could no longer test any of those. He could not touch those samples. Did I cause that problem? Probably. I wouldn't tell a politician anything anymore. And when I talk to you about politics someday, I'll tell you why. But I very much feel that Micheál went straight from our thing, look up this guy, what's he doing, cut the funding if he doesn't stop that. I don't know, but that's what I think happened. No. So anyway, and Jeff Bradstreet did not commit suicide. He was the most optimistic guy. He was also a minister as well, you know, and he had this open window based on Sound of Music, you know, when the Lord closes a door, he opens a window. I mean, this guy was a beautiful human being. And I stayed in touch with him for several years after. And he did not shoot himself in the chest, fall into a river, just after having all of his research confiscated by the CDC. Yes, no, he didn't do that. Anyways, what have I learned? I mean, I have learned so much about diet. And maybe a few little things I will share with you. I also want to tell you one other thing. When Jamie was at his low point, you know, he's back in a wheelchair, he came down from his usual 95 pounds to 65 pounds. He was like a skeleton, in and out of hospital in Cork. Finally sent up to Crumlin, even though he was slightly over age. He sent up to Crumlin, and he just sat there. And I knew exactly what we needed. We needed that colonoscopy. We needed to see those nodules. I knew what was there. And then he needed a feeding program. So finally, I had my father in America ring the consultant here and ask about, because I couldn't think any other way to get them to do the test. Simple test, they do it on everybody. And he rang and he just said, oh, I just want to ask about my grandson. When is he getting his colonoscopy, blah, blah, blah. So then they did it. And while Jamie's in recovery, and 3 times they had brought me in, and the doctor, Billy Burke, in Crumlin, tells me that if we don't get him on a feeding program, he's going to die. And I said, that's what I'm here for. That's what I've been looking for. And 3 times he tells me that. A half an hour later, I was sent down to the ward, I'm sitting on Jamie's bed. Dr. Billy Burke, a senior nurse, and 2 young doctors come in, very friendly, sit down, lovely warm setting, and tell me they had decided not to put him on a feeding program. His quality of life was poor, my quality of life is poor, and they had decided not to put him on a feeding program. In other words, they had decided he was to die. That's Ireland. I grabbed him out of there as soon as I could. I had to wait till the next morning because he'd had a heavy anesthetic. Brought him down. A new professor had just come into town, and working with it, we were able to bring up his weight, really, really work on diet. We learned things about buteyko breathing, very important, which has saved his life in ways. We learned about A2 milk, which brought up his weight. We learned about keto, and he is just about to start clinical keto in UCC, or in CUH, etc. And we're working all the time. And I'll just tell you where he is now. I want to tell you one little story. We've done so many things. He's now back to his 95 pounds. He has his program. He's considered officially he's profoundly mentally, intellectually impaired. And yet, I'll tell you, every once in a while he does something. And you think he understands everything. Well, for 10 years, one of his tutors has always believed he's in there. And for 10 years, he's tried to get him to use his finger to point to letters or to do letters, and no progress. And then one day, about 3 years ago, Jamie was trying to do it, wanting to do it, demanding to do it. So they did it. And what was the message? Pray for Carmen. For 6 weeks, or 6 to 8 weeks, we get the 2 or 3 times a week, because it was such a big effort. It's pray for Carmen. Now, Carmen was a Spanish tutor he had had 8 years before, who had returned to Spain, gotten married. Last I heard, about 6 years before, she was having her first baby. So one day, then he goes, email Carmen. His spelling's perfect. His favorite word is excellent. His spelling's perfect. But anyway, email Carmen. So found an old email, contacted Carmen, and she, oh, it's lovely to hear from you. How is Jamie? Blah, blah, blah. I wrote back and I told her he has broken into communication to tell us one thing: pray for Carmen. So she emailed back and said, I have the shivers. This is incredible, because a few days ago, my husband was in a serious car crash. We thought he was dead. By the time I got to the car, they said he might be alive, but he'll be ruined. They cut him out of the car, and he was perfect. And various people were saying, oh, miracle, miracle, But what really struck Carmen and her husband was one of the policemen and the ambulance driver said, someone's been praying for you. And that night, after he was checked out in hospital and they were home and they had 3 children, put them to bed, they sat down and both of them had remembered the same thing. And they compared notes, and neither of them could think of anybody that would have been praying for them. And the next day, we get the email, Carmen, and she gets the email. He has never mentioned Carmen again. He doesn't very often give messages, but when he does, it's to say, the most recent one is, tell Rosalina, I do not want 5 eggs in the morning. It makes me feel sick. But mostly it's, please rest. It's an excellent day. 5 minutes, okay. Then I'm going to skip on to where all of that has brought me, my favorite topic, farming. Right. I always wanted to be a farmer. And everywhere I've ever lived, tiny corporation houses, anywhere I've ever lived, I've had a garden, and I've never grown anything. The only calf I had ever owned died, just disaster. But a number of years ago, one of my sons, a plumber, decided to change careers and start growing. And we started with all these like food forests and things. We don't have a lot of land, right? But I had gotten really interested in farming because I was on the environment. I was on the climate change committee. I was on all of these things in Brussels, and I realized everything they're telling us is about money. It's not about human beings, and it's not about solutions. For instance, just CO2. Do you know that plants need CO2 to live? CO2 is not the problem. The problem is that it's going up instead of down. In nature, CO2 is supposed to go down and feed the plants. But because of how we farm, because we're covering the whole earth in concrete, it's because it's because we plow instead of let mulch grow. It doesn't go down. Like, we have created a world that isn't like a sponge anymore. The ground should be a sponge. It should all go down. Anyway, he suddenly decided to do this. And we have had the most amazing adventure. And I want to tell all of you it's not just grow your own food, but my son now has developed an acre. We have 4 acres, but there's only about 1.5 acres that's usable. But in that acre, he is now supporting a wife and 2 children. It doesn't take a lot of land to support a family with horticulture if you grow sustainably, regeneratively. He doesn't, the food is incredible, the taste is beautiful. People, once they buy his food, and it's not cheap. I eat all the twisty carrots and everything. I just go down and see what he isn't selling, and I eat that. But it is just incredible. And that is even in a decent-sized backyard. You could pay your rent or your mortgage on a decent-sized backyard if you're willing to learn. And one of the amazing things about growing in this way is the bottom line is you have to understand none of this happened by chance. There's a beautiful design. And if you want to grow, if you want to deal with slugs, you have to learn about slugs. You have to learn what their purpose is, what their habits are. If you want to grow a carrot, you got to learn about carrots. You got to learn what the design was, how to work with it, how to cooperate with nature, do the opposite of what farming has become, and that's the manipulation of nature, right? And we have, as I say, up to 1 o'clock, I was in my dirty coveralls, crawling along, pulling out, jumping up, digging, then crawling, etc. And it is an absolutely amazing adventure. He is not certified organic for one reason. We've never used any chemicals or anything. The land never had chemicals on it in living memory. Because the organic system is so far behind, and he's always learning ahead, that until something is established, it can't be checked and it can't be put on the list of what you can use. So if you're a frontier, if you're pushing out the boundaries all the time, then, and inventing things, like he makes his own tools, he modifies his own tools. For instance, right now he's using a paper pot transplanter, which it'll be 20 years before the organic system tests them and decide they're okay, but they're perfectly organic. Do you know what I mean? So he's chemical-free, local grown. But what I'm saying to you is, everything you're reading about climate change and all the rest, it's about money. If they really, wanted to feed people, have people healthy, and every generation improve the planet, make it more productive and all, they would not be doing what they're doing. It's about money, it's about creating a new currency, and it's about destruction and the elimination of human beings. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Kathy. So we can take a couple of quick questions.
Okay, sure.
Anyone have any questions? I've seen you first.
Hello, Kathy. Thanks for your talk. You were brilliant. I actually work in Crumlin Hospital, and I was seeing a lot of children with ear problems. And a friend of mine has a son who's constantly having ear infections and was in the hospital for a month last year. But I know that was obviously a problem. We'd seen a lot of children coming in with grommets. Now, you're talking about your child, your daughter, who had breathing problems. We also see a lot of that as well. I'm just wondering, did you ever get offered a sleep study to see why your child was having those problems, or did you just relate it to the vaccine?
Well, he's had lots of tests through the years, and the interesting test he had, which no one ever explained to me, but when I look back, when we were going to court about education for people with severe and profound, and I look back on all his records, I discovered that he had had the vaccine between 4 and 5 months. And I discovered that the only finding they had any, because otherwise he seemed very healthy, but there was one finding which they noted as significant but never investigated, was, if I can remember, it was an immune system thing. It was where he was very high in one of these immune type cells, which now it turns out, I'm just not neutrophils, or I can't remember exactly what they were. But since then, I've looked at it, and it's one of the things that you see in vaccine damage, that you have this hyper-reacting immune system, within the months after. And that was the one finding they did find when he was young in Chicago. Yeah, so look, autism is autoimmune. They want to say it's whatever. It's autoimmune, and so, yeah. But just on breathing was very life-threatening for him, because over the years he was mouth breathing and panicked a lot, and so he would get these times when suddenly we would realize the room had gone very quiet, and we'd look and he'd be purple and just beginning to go like this. And what sorted that out was Buteyko. Does anyone know Buteyko breathing? Okay, Buteyko was the name of a Russian doctor. And he maintained that you should be breathing like you did when you were born. Baby stomachs go up and down. You breathe with the diaphragm. You breathe through your nose, and you breathe less. We're all told to deep breathe and all. Well, breathe with your diaphragm, breathe less, and breathe only through your nose. And although we couldn't get Jamie just to breathe through his nose, we were putting swaddles, like these kidney belts you buy in Lidl. They've got Velcro, putting those around his chest, so he had to breathe lower. And we made sure everyone around him, nobody was breathing fast. And just those two improvements, even though we couldn't do the full Buteyko, meant that stopped completely. He's never had that again. And that was becoming life-threatening, this apnea. And what happened when I was doing it a bit as well, and I had this thing where my fingers would go white. It could be July, and my fingers would go frozen, and they were getting worse and worse and worse over the years. And from the minute I started breathing through my nose, breathing from the diaphragm, and breathing less, I've never had it again. It just disappeared after maybe 15 years of progressively getting worse, this Raynaud's.
Another question here, please. Just on food growing and farming, have you heard of a fella called Paul Gauci?
Yeah, he'd be somebody that might Some would have
there's a
followed.
documentary on YouTube called Back to Eden, and the magic.
Brilliant.
It's absolutely incredible, and this stuff works. I went and saw a farm up in Roscommon. He's got a YouTube channel called Gardens for Life. But check out the Paul Gauchi's documentary, Wood Chips.
I have actually sent that video to probably 100 people at this stage. And the other one that I think is very important, it's one of those seminal things, is Alan Savory's TED Talk on decertification. Alan Savory, Savory, a TED Talk on decertification. If you put those two, the Back to Eden and that together, you know, we have to keep the ground covered. Now, we were using wood chips, and long term we're going to go back to wood chips, but the problem for us with wood chips is slugs hide in them. And in Ireland, slugs are your biggest problem. But the other one is that they rob nitrogen for the first 3 or 4 years until they're really well rotted. So we're composting them, but we're not covering with them, just because they just leach nitrogen. Long term, they're brilliant. And with Paul Gucci, you know, I mean, he's got 20 years of wood chips there, all nicely rotted. But if you're starting out, yes, make yourself a big compost pile with wood chips and things, but don't plan to use it for a while. You know.
Okay, one last question. Last one.
Oh, if you want to look at our kind of effort, we're so busy he hasn't kept up the website, but it's called Food for Humans, F-O-R, Food for Humans, because our thought is the reason to regenerate the soil. I mean, the soil is what it's about. It's not about the air, it's about the soil. Is to feed people, to nourish people. Well-nourished people are much happier people. It's not about carbon credits and all the rest. So we named it Food for Humans, food fit for humans, because most of what we eat is not fit for human consumption. Sorry, there was a question back there?
Do you think that the heavy metals that they use to preserve vaccines have anything to do with the neurological problems that are caused?
I would have no doubt that I would have no doubt that's one of many problems, and a serious problem. And what's interesting is the research is leading us to think that even worse than thimerosal is the aluminium. Because now they've actually tracked the root of the aluminium, which is that it goes into the brain, it stays there, and every once in a while flares up, but it never leaves. So aluminium could be far worse than thimerosal.
Okay, good stuff. Round of applause there for Kathy. Brilliant. Well done, Kathy.